Hello everyone, this is part 2 in the new series on the psychological humanities. In the most recent post, which began the series, I said that I would discuss Thomas Teo's 2017 article titled From Psychological Science to the Psychological Humanities, Building a General Theory of Subjectivity. If you have not yet read that article, I'd encourage you to do so because what I have written here and what I'm speaking about now in the video is a response to Teo's article. While thinking about that article, let us also remember our general plan. What is our general plan? We want to know what the psychological humanities are. Very naive and simple question, but it's good to have these simple questions in mind. What we also want to know is whether and why we might be interested in psychological humanities. My first reaction after reading Teo's article was an urge to hang on to something concrete, some example, to share something concrete with you. Maybe a personal story, something that can ground our discussion. I think I have this urge as a result of reading Teo's very abstract theoretical style of writing. But I'm going to delay my storytelling, delay that for a brief time, and begin with talking about what I liked about the article. So in my view, the article is clear, obviously very well researched, balanced, and thorough. Nobody will accuse Teo of being unreasonably selective, overemphasizing, for example, one approach over others. His classifications identify the broad categories within the humanities. Philosophical, these 6 categories are philosophical approach, historical, socio-political, cultural, which includes post-colonial and indigenous studies, artistic, and technological, concerned with science and technology studies. In addition to this plurality of perspectives, the article is also organized around a single notion, subjectivity. That is to say, the 6 approaches are presented as 6 ways of being concerned with subjectivity. But let's revise that last sentence. The 6 approaches themselves reflect not just in terms of, they're not just different from each other in terms of what they are about, what they are paying attention to. The 6 approaches reflect also distinct forms of subjectivity. Historical study corresponds to a form of subjectivity, a way of caring, being concerned. Historical study corresponds to a form of subjectivity that can and should be distinguished from the philosophical form. That is, by the way, why reading about philosophers, which is mostly historical, isn't the same as studying philosophy. And here's a quote by Sam Rocha, which I like, relevant to this point. Quote, "Most people nowadays do not study philosophy itself. They study philosophers. Most so-called philosophers these days do not write or teach philosophy. They write and teach about philosophers who, once upon a time, wrote and taught philosophy." This is from a primer for philosophy and education, page 14. What Rocha is referring to here is a confusion about forms of subjectivity, the possibility that we might mistake or confuse, and in other words, an inability to distinguish among forms of subjectivity. This is the reason why Teo's classifications are very useful and crucial, not just important in distinguishing the differences between those 6 categories, but how those 6 categories as a super category differ from the approaches of natural and social scientific psychology. We should be careful not to forget when we think about different approaches in the humanities, that we are paying attention both to their motives and to their subject matter, both to where they come from and where they are going, to their formation, how they are formed, and to their problems, what they care about, to their education, the education that is necessary for them to arise, and to their continued movement. In the natural and social sciences, and in psychology as a natural and social science, our attention goes to the discipline's subject matter, not motives, not the origin of the motives. We pay attention to where the discipline is going, but not always to where the discipline comes from. Its problems, but not its formation. Its continued movement, but not its education. This is why history of psychology often gives rise to critique, or makes the necessity of critique obvious. Of course, if you ask a cognitive psychologist, someone who studies, for example, visual attention, about the motives or the formation of their research, where their line of research comes from, how is it motivated, you'll get a justification too from that type of person for why they are doing what they are doing. But if you investigate further, patiently, you will discover that those justifications are pre-packaged. They are part of being disciplined in the natural sciences. Designed, the justification that is given to us by a cognitive psychologist, experimental or neuroscientific type psychologist. The justification is designed to stop the line of questioning and redirect attention back to the subject matter, to what is actually happening in the research. In fact, I would argue that if you pay close attention, psychological science has a constant wish to be unaware of itself, of itself as a form of subjectivity, of the form of such subjectivity that sustains it. It wants to cut ties with its origin. By contrast, if you question someone in the humanities about their work and the discipline, they should ideally be willing to talk about their origin or formation as much as they are willing to talk about their subject matter, their problems. There's a metaphor here that might be useful. Let's imagine being a house guest with two different hosts. One host expects you to remain within a certain acceptable range when you are at their house. You are expected here not to go, for example, to the basement or to the bedroom. It seems reasonable. Some hosts have that attitude. The other host, by contrast, welcomes you everywhere in their home. You feel at home, truly at home when you're there. There is so much that we can say about the difference between these two hosts. The difference between them is obviously not limited to that superficial level of where they want you to go. Just to pick one among the differences, we could say that the first host is more attached to an image of their home. They have a particular image of their home in mind, and they want to preserve that image at the cost of limiting your movement. Now is a good time for sharing that story I promised you. The first time I stood up in front of a group of academics to talk about a critique of psychology was during the summer of 2014. I was a guest at the University of Vienna. There was an informal session with the rest of the department, doctoral students, professors, postdocs. It was a meeting where everyone was talking about the general directions of their research, their challenges, plans, hopes, and possible collaborations. I remember the look in everybody's eyes when I started speaking. You could read in their faces this question: is he having an emotional breakdown right now? The more they listened to me, the more that question became visible in their faces. Needless to say, I was not having an emotional breakdown. What I was saying that day was the result of many months of study, careful study and thought. But to them, it looked like a breakdown, an emotional breakdown, because I was going out of that acceptable range. In scientific psychology, certain topics come up in public conversation if and only if the person is having a breakdown. These topics include certain parts of an academic career, politics of science, institutional dynamics, power, doubt in the worth of your research, the appropriateness or inappropriateness of methods, the limits of psychology as a science, and so on and so forth. We can connect this anecdote to the idea of psychological humanities. Now that we have read Theo's article, you could consider this footnote that I'm just going to add to any future definition of psychological humanities. Humanities entail an education as a result of which we can entertain a wide range of topics without regarding that exploration as a breakdown. To borrow the old-fashioned Lacanian terms, Jacques Lacan, the humanities enable us to move away from seeing the discourse of the hysteric as the only possible interruption to the discourse of the university. And to follow with the terminology, that same education cultivates the ability to see the discourse of the analyst. Without the humanities, we would inevitably overestimate the reasonableness and apparent sufficiency of the natural and social scientific psychology, which means tacitly presupposing that only an unreasonable discourse, only an unreasonable voice can interrupt them, can interrupt their discourses. With reference to Lacan's four discourses, one objection to Theo's article would be that it presents itself as part of what Lacan describes as the discourse of the university. So Theo wants to join that discourse as opposed to interrupting it. This shows up not only in the body of the text, the way that he justifies the humanities' approach to psychology, but also in the title itself. The hint is in the sequence of words, from science to humanities. We could read this sequence as inviting a move from the sciences to the humanities, or maybe even imagining that if psychological scientists continue their work, they will find themselves in the humanities eventually. To understand why this isn't possible, imagine the metaphor of the two hosts. Once you accept the rules of the first host who wanted to restrict your movements, then no amount of further movement within that acceptable range, as long as your movements are within that predetermined range, no amount of movement within that range would give us the view of the repressed places, the places that are supposed to be hidden. I see the rhetorical point in Theo's presentation. I see why he is doing he has written the article in that way. I think I understand it. And his appeal to a general theory of subjectivity is reminiscent of the unification and fragmentation discourse in psychology. I believe what Theo is doing is trying to solve the problem of how to address unsympathetic readers, which means he's attempting to translate his ideas about psychological humanities into a language that is acceptable, understandable by mainstream psychologists. Does this work? I'm not sure. But in this case, even a failure can be very instructive. Setting aside the rhetorical strategy, I also disagree with Theo's characterization of the arts. This is probably my only major disagreement with this article. He assigns the arts an overly specific function, namely the function of resistance. The attitude that seeks justification in terms of utility of things, like philosophy is justified because it does this, because it gives us the conditions of possibility for psychology. History brings this, it can help us, historical study helps us trace the development of subjectivity and how it forms differently in different times and cultures. And arts similarly can do this for us, they can help us identify moments of resistance. This is the style of seeking justification in terms of the function, the outcome, the utility of each approach. This is the natural attitude. And isn't this attitude what we learn to suspend with the help of philosophy, with the arts, and with the humanities? The more I think about this question, the more I realize that psychological humanities, emphasis on the psychological, might itself indicate a haste, a rushing into utility, rather than embodying the appropriate attitude that is proper to the humanities. Do we adopt the phrase psychological humanities to promise a utility for psychological sciences or the psychology as an academic discipline? Let's say we embrace the humanities. What we get in return may or may not be relevant to our psychological concerns. It may or may not benefit psychological departments all over the world. Psychological humanities presupposes a promise of discipline-specific utility, I think, unless I am vastly mistaken. When we think of narrowing down the field of humanities and decide, okay, now we pay attention to the psychological part of the humanities. Once we narrow down the field of humanities like that, aren't we just replicating the same problem that was created by the natural and social sciences? If the problem is with the restriction, not with the particular field to which we are restricted, then we should ask again, why psychological humanities? Needless to say, here we should not answer. Our answers cannot be along the lines of, because we are employed in departments of psychology, because we are reading and writing in psychological journals. It has to be another kind of justification. So here I can leave the discussion of this article. In short, Theo's article is clear and useful. It's a very useful overview. It should be on the reading list for students of psychology. And let's keep it in mind and return to it at a later point. For the next time, or next part in this series, I am turning to a more recent paper by Thomas Theo, published in 2020 in the journal Theory and Psychology. The title of that paper is Theorizing in Psychology, From the Critique of a Hyperscience to Conceptualizing Subjectivity. If you're interested in preparing, then please read it. All right. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will continue in the next part. Any comments, suggestions, as always, more than welcome.